Reset, let's talk about diversity. Im vergangenen Jahr hat die Dialogreihe Everything is Possible, weibliche Erfolgsgeschichten, einen lebhaften Diskurs an der Muthesius Kunsthochschule in Gang gebracht. Darauf aufbauend und in Auseinandersetzung mit den weltweiten Antirassismusdebatten starten wir, eine Gruppe verschiedener AkteurInnen der Kunsthochschule, nun unter dem Arbeitstitel Reset, let's talk about diversity, eine Veranstaltungsreihe, die hier im Einblick-Ausblick-Radio ihren Anfang nimmt und im Wintersemester mit unterschiedlichen Veranstaltungsformaten fortgesetzt wird. Antidiskriminierung und Chancengleichheit sind prozesshafte Themen, die es stetig zu erarbeiten gilt, die aber dringend auch den Austausch und Dialog im Miteinander brauchen. Hierzu haben wir unterschiedlichste Personen eingeladen, Bücher durchforstet und versucht, eine Plattform bereitzustellen. Freut euch auf den kommenden Beitrag. Let's retalk diversity.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Scherler and I'm an art student from Basel in Switzerland. And through a research project, I was very lucky to do a workshop with the meme class last autumn. And we still kept in contact. We're still working on projects together. And that is somehow what you could say is the reason why I'm talking to you now, or like my link to the Muthesius Kunsthochschule, because I don't have the direct one of being a student there. And I've been doing some readings lately, a lot more. I started when lockdown hit. I think Germany and Switzerland were really kind of at the same time. I started doing readings on Harry Potter to give some comfort, because staying at home was very new to, all of us. And I'm still doing some readings now, but they are more concerned with like current political discourse. So I've been reading Caroline Emke, who I really admire, and also Ta-Nehisi Coates. If you want to have a listen, you can head over to Instagram and find me there. And this lecture will actually be in English because A, I hope that it is more accessible this way to more people, and B, because the texts we are going to read from and that I will cite, there are like 99% are written in English, so we're not going to translate them, so we're just going to go for the original. And I actually want this free lecture to be about, I want to share some thoughts and researches concerning the blind spots at art school institutions, mostly concerning the discourse about queer feminism, about anti-racism or post-colonialism, and about environmental awareness. And I will specifically talk about art schools. I mean, of course, also because of the event that we're broadcasting from now, but also because I think the problematic there in regards to those topics is very unique and is very complex as well. Because while in some other industries, those topics are not really talked about, like they're not given thought, they are not popular yet. In the art world, those topics have been used for years for institutions to portray themselves in a good light. And so, the art schools, it claims to be politically woke, it takes pride in reflecting society critically, and it cultivates the idea of artists being, the intellectual avant-garde and, that is hyper-progressive and inclusive. So advertisements in the art industry works very much through fitting this woke image and this inclusive image. But maybe, sometimes that's just from the outside. So what I've been doing the past couple of weeks, I've been collecting open letters written by students or staff or sometimes even alumni that are concerning those issues. And, it's really interesting that all the letters I'm reading from there were written in June and July. And I think that the increased attention towards and also the increased popularity of the Black Lives Matter movement have actually given us energy to finally, tackle the things or like call out the inequalities that we felt uncomfortable with for a very long time. But somehow, the last energy burst was kind of missing to finally kick butts, and I think that's really happening now. And so all those letters, they have happened in combination with that movement and inspired by the movement. And since I'm talking about doing anti-racist work and also, trying to find a place in a movement that you want to support and also must support. I believe that, like attending protests safely, of course, as we're still in a pandemic, but also, reading and educating yourself and others. I think that the most effective thing you can do is to take the critical thinking into your scene, to your schools and to your jobs, because your scene has a very unique way of enforcing a sexist and racist system. And so while there might be problems, or there are problems, in the art industry, but also in, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, I, as a person that studies art and does art, I am much better equipped to tackle that within the art scene, because I know much more nuances. I am directly with the people concerned, and I only understand what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry very abstractly. So I think I don't understand the very fine mechanisms that work there. So I think it's very important to really take it back to your bubble also. Right. So the open letters that I've selected and will discuss with you are from the Royal College of Arts, which is based in London, and we also have the Goldsmith University, which is also based in London. We have the UDK, Universität der Künste, which is in Berlin, and their lecture is in German, actually. It's a very short one. And we have the Cooper Union in New York, and we also have ECAL, which is based in Lausanne in Switzerland. And I actually would like to start with ECAL because I had briefly studied there. I started studying photography and then quit quite quickly and changed to fine arts in Basel now, but that means I have a bit more, personal understanding of the exact thing that might go on there. Right, so we will start with a quote from that letter, which says, ECAL, which prizes itself with critical thinking, simultaneously encourages its students to outsource this very education at their own interest. A university cannot entirely allocate these educational responsibilities to its students and subsequently claim leadership of the institution's progressiveness. Our educational system shouldn't feel entitled to appropriate the critical works of students for its benefit when the sole intention is deflecting culpability in the failure to address critical issues of race, class, and gender from within. Now, I know that a lot of different art universities work differently, which is, of course, very obvious, but with when you're studying at ECAL, one of the very first things you do is you sign a contract, and that contract, it says that you have to mention the school whenever you publish something during your studies, but also for an extended period of time after you've completed your studies, and your work is also owned by the art school, so they can publish it whenever and however they want. And so there is very much the link of the school using the students' work, A, however they want, and B, as advertisement. It works, of course, it works really well because they're a well-renowned school, and a lot of their graduates have quite great success. They win prizes, they win awards, and they get attention. And so to have the name of the school attached, of course, it brings attention to the school. And so if the students are going to produce critical work, that notion is going to be transferred to the understanding of how the school works. And the school, it claims to be very contemporary. It claims to, work on the topics that are trending right now. Right. So basically what's happening is they have, the students of ECAL, they have written a letter before where they asked for more critical education, and the response from the school was that the students should do that on their own in their free time. And let's just read how the letter goes on at some other point. It reads, "This lack of involvement provoke certain contradictions, also in terms of academic expectations. How can a CAL expect student work to be critical when the school is not willing to provide a critical education? How can it claim credit for critical student work and yet refuse to implement internal structures that are actively anti-racist? In what ways does ECAL advocate and provide visibility to projects that question existing power structures defined by race, class, and gender? It kind of sums up what I tried to explain before, that they expect something from their students, that they expect from their students to, deal with topics that are trending. Like at the moment we have much more light on queer people when it comes to, like some beauty brands, when it comes to art. And so, of course, they expect students to work also with that, but they do not provide the critical education dealing with those topics and actually, creating a thinking about it. But they just want to profit. And as you know, like every student letter usually works, they complete it with claims, which involve, amongst other things, transparency about sponsors, which again, I think for ECAL is a really big one, because it works together with big brands. And so it reads, who are ECAL sponsors / donors, and do they in any direct or indirect way generate funds from colonial exploitation? Which I think there are many that do that. And they as well claim or want transparency about employing Black staff, while also providing a safe work environment for them. What system is in place, if any, that provides a dignified way to report incidences of racialization, discrimination, and tokenization? And to actively invite the teachers to make an effort in being informed on Black artists, curators, and galleries. Are Black artists being taken into account to the same degree without having to make their work about race? And I think that claim is incredibly important, and it's also been broadly discussed, at very different levels, that when institutions, they often take some kind of pride when they hire someone of color or someone queer or, someone of another marginalized group. And they most often, they invite them to talk about exactly that. So they invite POCs to talk about racism. They invite queer people to talk about sexuality and queer feminism, etc., etc. And what we actually really need is we need people of diverse background in whatever. Like, we need everyone in everything. We need Black people or people of color. We need them to talk about graphic design. We need queer people to talk about, the perfect photographic lighting, because I think we will broaden our horizon, or to frame it differently, someone that has a different experience, reality to yours, their experience will shine through in whatever they talk about. And so often, things are promised by authorities and they are not followed through with, which is something that has also happened at the UDK in Berlin. So if we look at the Instagram letter that can be found these days, it says that the art school has agreed to extend their diversity policies. I think between the time frame of 2018 to 2020. But they say that nothing has happened. And so what they claim, amongst others, is that the staff, that they should be educated in sensitivity to discrimination workshops, and that there be financial and institutional support for the development of the diversity policy development. And so far, it has been happening through free labor, which again, I think is a very crucial point, as very often the weight of reflection is shouldered on students and volunteers, be it as, at ECAL, where students are asked to create critical work, yet they receive no critical education, and so they have to do their own education in their free time, and be it through shaping safe spaces, or for example, where I study, we repeatedly get the reply from professors that we must do all the suggestions, like they understand that things might not go perfectly well, but that the work is with us, while they deny their position of power and also responsibility, while they are the ones who are paid to shape our educations, and why it is their job to provide the best environment to nurture new art and new thinking. But also the financial aspect that is discussed in those open letters is also another one. So if we have a look at the letter from Goldsmiths, which was actually written by alumni, they state, in response to the global pandemic, Goldsmith, University of London have decided not to extend the contracts of 472 precarious academic staff, 75% of whom are BAME. Francis Corner, warden at Goldsmiths, has made statements in support of the Black Lives Matter movement whilst dismissing hundreds of Black and POC staff. Now, just as a small side note, the term BAME is, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, an abbreviation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic, used to refer to people in the UK who are not white. They further write, Goldsmith has a reputation for being fostering a critical and intellectually rigorous environment for its students' body. With its white dominant faculty and student body, this criticality became a breeding ground for casual and violent racism, especially in the discussion of BIPOC work. BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, People of Color. This came at a great emotional cost to BIPOC students who felt alienated, silenced, antagonized, and bullied, while simultaneously shouldering the burden of educating staff and students ignorant in race and identity discourse. Furthermore, the critical studies component of the course was overwhelmingly white Eurocentric, a practice which remained unquestioned and uncharged during our time as students, and a default through which students were encouraged to develop their artistic practice. It is not enough to have a single dedicated module that deals with race and identity discourse. Rather, the fine art department should work to decenter the focus across all modules from a wide Eurocentric perspective. So including BIPOC into your stuff is not only important in terms of equality in jobs and equal chances, but it is also incredibly important for students. So they have someone to identify with and someone, who really understands them. And also that white people do not live in a, exclusively white bubble, but that they have a broadened horizon on other lived realities. And some things I also have noticed in my own studies is that there are a lot of white professors, who do their, let's call them like their homework, which means that they read theories about anti-racism and feminism, and they learn their terms and important authors, but it always feels like a distant vocabulary, and it never is impacted by a lived reality. The RCA, the Royal College of Art students, have, apart from writing an open letter, also started an online petition concerning the mistrust in the Vice-Chancellor's office. And so when we read the beginning of the petition's description, we have a summary of what we've already learned from other schools. Over the last 10 years, conditions for staff and students at the RCA have plummeted. Institutional racism is endemic, and the recommendations of the college's own Equalities and Diversity Panel are ignored. We have received no response to our open letter on systemic racism, nor any feedback on the actions we requested the college take. Pernicious inequality is also evident with regards to sexism, as evinced by the gender pay gap, hiring practices, maternity/paternity leave policies, and systemic misogyny in the workplace. These issues also have intersectional ramifications. Permanent staffing has been cut by approximately 50%, while casual staff has increased by approximately 25%. Students have to contend with a worse staff/student ratio, less space, and hugely increasing fees. As well as, we are in a desperate situation on three fronts. First, institutional racism is not being dealt with at the RCA, nor are gender-based and intersectional issues of inequality and discrimination. Second, the college has announced a hiring freeze and sweeping cuts regardless of intake, which will mean over 200 hourly paid lecturers who make up the majority of staff will likely not be working next year. The remaining staff will therefore have their workload increased, further worsening the already deteriorating student conditions. And third, the college refuses to answer letters from UCU, which is, the student organization this letter is coming from, head office, and is also refusing to release relevant financial data to us in written form, meaning we cannot meaningfully negotiate with them. The call to action here includes for the hiring committee to be intersectionally diverse, which means made of people from various ethnicities, genders, economic backgrounds, sexualities, experiences of physical access, and neurodiversity. Now, when they talk about the hiring committee, they are specifically referring to the job of the head of inclusion, which is also what the whole letter kind of is about. So the very first goal was a call for the RCA to employ a permanent full-time equality, diversity and inclusion officer with personal experience of being on the receiving end of systemic racism. So again, what comes in is the lived reality and experience, which is what students wish for in their professors and educators. And so the job of inclusion, or the head of inclusion job, as they call it now, was actually assigned to a white man, to Mark Harrison. And so the resistance is big, and students want the position to be retracted so that a more appropriate job description and recruitment process can be outlined and pursued in collaboration with a new hiring committee. It was announced as the presentation was completed that the position, then entitled Head of Equality and Diversity, had been open for 4 days and was shutting the next day. Notwithstanding, research presented to the ED committee showed that recruiters had previously expressed that they did not know where to advertise to find potential black and brown staff. None of the African, Caribbean or Asian ED committee members were informed of the position being open with enough time to share it with their networks, which undoubtedly are full of qualified candidates. So it just proves again the point of somehow trying to generate jobs and generate awareness, but not following through. It's more. It feels much more like a branding thing when you have such a job at a school, but you don't put in the effort to find someone who is actually affected by the things that they would take care of. Right. So, but while all these things, it's very frustrating to think about, and it's also, I think, frustration of students at art schools are very big. It doesn't really matter what kind of friends I talk with that study art, in terms of where they study, there is issues everywhere, and a lot of them are similar. But to find a bit more positivity, if we actually look at the Cooper's Union letter, is written in a much different tone. And I actually don't know if that's, a particular American thing of how to formulate things. But they write it in a much more hopeful tone, or encouraging tone, maybe one could say, and less calling out, aggressive, more like, you can do this kind of style. If you read one of the beginning paragraphs, it says, the purpose of this document is to not only provide a list of actions that the Cooper Union should read and respond to individually, but to build a framework that further initiates independent actions as a result. This document is intended to be an ongoing resource for making the Cooper Union an anti-racist institution. This is an opportunity to set an example for institutions across the nation. The Cooper Union has been on the right side of history many times, and today's difficult events present another chance for us to do the same. For this document to be effective, it assumes the good faith of all those addressed and their subordinates. As an anti-racist school, it is one that actively addresses... An anti-racist school is one that actively addresses issues including, but not limited to, race, gender and identity, mental health, climate, class, sexuality, disability, functional democratic governance, and freedom of expression. One of course, very American claim they have is to remove police from the grounds, and also other links they have to the police, which is not so much a topic in Europe because our police system works differently. But in America, you have police involved at most schools, I think, which is indeed very worrying and also weird, actually, from a European perspective. And what they also write about is, of course, that it creates an unsafe feeling for many students that are not white or come from a different background, in terms of, like also people of not the typical binary gender get assaulted by police. So police is a big point in making things feel safe. But other claims include: we cannot decolonize our curriculum without first addressing the means by which we teach and how our pedagogies reinforce structural racism. Be transparent with students regarding the rationale behind decisions made about curriculum. As artists, we sit precariously as markers as well as makers of history. As markers, we risk upholding a system that has omitted narratives for centuries at the institutional level. As makers, we are responsible for practicing modes of creation that do not uphold this system. We should work to build a platform to uplift the various ways in which these stories are told and to highlight that they have the power to accomplish. And also to expand the breadth of artist students are exposed to during studio classes. Consider scholarships and theory written by BIPOC/queer artists as a means of broadening students' visual and artistic vocabulary and to provide a shared language for critical engagement. I think vocabulary is a very interesting term there, because vocabulary makes us understand partially our own reality and also the reality of others. I mean, if you take, for example, sexuality and gender identity, I think many people find a lot more peace when they learn vocabulary to actually describe what they are feeling. For example, I grew up on the countryside, and the only terms I knew was, you would either be straight or you would be gay. And gay was, of course, it was connotated as something very, very negative, as it was a very conservative area. And I think I was 19 years old or something when I actually learned the term bisexual, and suddenly everything made perfect sense of how I was feeling. And so I think, learning vocabulary is tremendously important for you to understand yourself, but also to be able to paint a more differentiated picture of someone else and their lived reality. But let's go further with the letter. Give student organizations the option to propose a budget for their initiatives and, if approved, receive upfront funding to implement and administer that initiative. The reimbursement system at Cooper creates financial barriers for students who wish to propose new initiatives but cannot afford to provide the necessary funding upfront themselves. So in this letter, we actually have, a direct call to end the free labor problem that we talked about before with the UDK and their diversity policies, or with ECAL. And so they directly, they're not only pointing out the problem, but they're like, come on, we need funding if you want us to do work. And they actually conclude their letter again in that hopeful tone that I've been talking about, which I think is super fascinating. And so they write, "We hope that the addressees view us not as naive, but hopeful, and that the breadth of our request demonstrates faith in this institution's governance and potential as we move forward. We, the undersigned, can offer no more than our consistent participation, our unfailing support, our thoughts, and our criticisms. You, the addressees, hold the keys to the change we wish to see and know is possible. We look forward to working with you to make the Cooper Union a better place for its current community and for the generations of makers and thinkers who will contribute to this place for years to come." And with that kind of optimism, I would actually like to introduce you to some other reading and conclude the student-led thing and read to you the introduction chapter of Teaching to Transgress, a book written by Bell Hooks, who is an author, professor, feminist, and social activist. Her writing has been about the intersectionality of race, capitalism, and gender. And she's written, like a lot of books and numerous articles. And I think in that writing that I'm going to read from, we might find a bit more of an uplifting way of looking at those problems, or finding ways to rethink education. All right, reading the introduction to Teaching to Transgress. We start with page 1. In the weeks before, the English department at Oberlin College was about to decide whether or not I would be granted tenure, I was haunted by dreams of running away, of disappearing, yes, even of dying. These dreams were not a response to fear that I would not be granted tenure. They were a response to the reality that I would be granted tenure. I was afraid that I would be trapped in the academy forever. Instead of feeling elated when I received tenure, I fell into a deep, life-threatening depression. Since everyone around me believed that I should be relieved, thrilled, proud, I felt guilty about my real feelings and could not share them with anyone. The lecture circuit took me to sunny California and the New Age world of my sister's house in Laguna Beach, where I was able to chill out for a month. When I shared my feelings with my sister, she's a therapist, she reassured me that they were entirely appropriate because, she said, you never wanted to be a teacher. Since you were little, all you ever wanted to do was write. She was right. It was always assumed by everyone else that I would become a teacher. In the apartheid South, black girls from working class backgrounds had 3 career choices. We could marry, we could work as maids, we could become school teachers. And since, according to the sexist thinking of the time, men did not really desire smart women, it was assumed that signs of intelligence sealed one's fate. From grade school on, I was destined to become a teacher. But the dream of becoming a writer was always present within me. From childhood, I believed that I would teach and write. Writing would be the serious work. Teaching would be the not-so-serious I need to make a living job. Writing, I believed then, was all about the private belonging and personal glory, but teaching was about service, giving back to one's community. For black folks, teaching, educating, was fundamentally political because it was rooted in anti-racist struggle. Indeed, my all-black grade schools became the location where I experienced learning as revolution. Almost all our teachers at Booker T. Washington were black women. They were committed to nurturing intellect so that we could become scholars, thinkers, and cultural workers. Black folks who used our minds. We learned early that our devotion to learning, to a life of the mind, was a counter-hegemonic act, a fundamental way to resist every strategy of white racist colonization. Though they did not define or articulate these practices in theoretical terms, my teachers were enacting a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance that was profoundly anti-colonial. Within these segregated schools, black children who were deemed exceptional, gifted, were given special care. Teachers worked with and for us to ensure that we would fulfill our intellectual destiny and by so doing uplift the race. My teachers were on a mission. To fulfill that mission, my teachers made sure they knew us. They knew our parents, our economic status, where we worshipped, what our homes were like, and how we were treated in their family. I went to school at a historical moment where I was being taught by the same teachers who had taught my mother, her sister, and her brothers. My effort and ability to learn was always contextualized within the framework of generational family experience. Certain behaviors, gestures, habits of being were traced back. Attending school then was sheer joy. I loved being a student. I loved learning. School was the place of ecstasy, pleasure and danger. To be changed by ideas was pure pleasure. But to learn ideas that ran counter to values and beliefs learned at home was to place oneself at risk, to enter the dangerous zone. Home was the place where I was forced to conform to someone else's image of who and what I should be. School was the place where I could forget the self and, through ideas, reinvent myself. School changed utterly with racial integration. Gone was the messianic seal to transform our minds and beings that had characterized teachers and their pedagogical practices in our all-black schools. Knowledge was suddenly about information only. It had no relation to how we lived, behaved. It was no longer connected to anti-racist struggle. Bused to white schools, we soon learned that obedience, and not a zealous will to learn, was what was expected of us. Too much eagerness to learn could easily be seen as a threat to white authority. When we entered racist, desegregated white schools, we left the world where teachers believed that to educate black children rightly would require a political commitment. Now, we were mainly taught by white teachers whose lessons reinforced racist stereotypes. For black children, education was no longer about the practice of freedom. Realizing this, I lost my love of school. The classroom was no longer a place of pleasure or ecstasy. School was a political place, since we were always having to counter white racist assumptions that we're genetically inferior. That we were genetically inferior, never as capable as white peers, even unable to learn. Yet the politics were no longer counter-hegemonic. You were always and only responding and reacting to white folks. That shift from beloved all-black schools to white schools where black students were always seen as interlopers, as not really belonging, taught me the difference between education as the practice of freedom and education that merely strives to reinforce domination. The rare white teacher who dared to resist, who would not allow racist biases to determine how we were taught, sustained the belief that learning as its most powerful could indeed liberate. A few black teachers had joined us in the desegregation process, and although it was more difficult, they continued to nurture black students even as their efforts were constrained by the suspicion they were favoring their own race. Despite intensely negative experiences, I graduated from school still believing that education was enabling, that it enhanced our capacity to be free. When I began undergraduate work at Stanford University, I was enthralled with the process of becoming an insurgent black intellectual. It surprised and shocked me to sit in classes where professors were not excited about teaching, where they did not seem to have a clue that education was about the practice of freedom. During college, the primary lesson was reinforced. We were to learn obedience to authority. In graduate school, the classroom became a place I hated, yet a place where I struggled to claim and maintain the right to be an independent thinker. The university and the classroom began to feel more like a prison, a place of punishment and confinement rather than a place of promise and possibility. I wrote my first book during those undergraduate years, even though it was not published until years later. I was writing, but more importantly, I was preparing to become a teacher. Accepting the teaching profession as my destiny, I was tormented by the classroom reality I had known both as an undergraduate and graduate student. The vast majority of our professors lacked basic communication skills. They were not self-actualized, and they often used the classroom to enact rituals of control that were about domination and the unjust exercise of power. In these settings, I learned a lot about the kind of teacher I did not want to become. In graduate school, I found that I was often bored in class. The banking system of education, based on the assumption that memorizing information and regurgitating it represented gaining knowledge that could be deposited, stored, and used at a later date, did not interest me. I wanted to become a critical thinker, yet that longing was often seen as a threat to authority. Individual white male students who were seen as exceptional were often allowed to chart their intellectual journeys, but the rest of us, and particularly those from marginal groups, were always expected to conform. Nonconformity, on our part, was viewed with suspicion, as empty gestures of defiance aimed at masking inferiority or substandard work. In those days, those of us from marginal groups who were allowed to enter prestigious, predominantly white colleges were made to feel that we were there not to learn, but to prove that we were the equal of whites. We were there to prove this by showing how well we could become clones of our peers. As we constantly confronted biases, an undercurrent of stress diminished our learning experience. My reaction to this stress and to the ever-present boredom and the apathy that pervaded my classes was to imagine ways that teaching and the learning experience could be different. When I discovered the work of the Brazilian thinker Paulo Freire, my first introduction to critical pedagogy, I found a mentor and a guide, someone who understood that learning could be liberatory. With his teachings and my growing understanding of the ways in which the education I had received in all-black Southern school had been empowering, I began to develop a blueprint for my own pedagogical practice. Already deeply engaged with feminist thinking, I had no difficulty bringing that critique to Freire's work. Significantly, I felt that this mentor and guide, whom I had never seen in the flesh, would encourage and support my challenge to his ideas if he was truly committed to education as the practice of freedom. At the same time, I used his pedagogical paradigms to critique the limitations of feminist classrooms. During my undergraduate and graduate school years, only white women professors were involved in developing women's studies programs. And even though I taught my first class as a graduate student on black women writers from a feminist perspective, it was in the context of a black studies program. At that time, I found white women professors were not eager to nurture any interest in feminist thinking and scholarship on the part of black female students if that interest included critical challenge. Yet their lack of interest did not discourage me from involvement with feminist ideas or participation in the feminist classroom. Those classrooms were the only space where pedagogical practices were interrogated, where it was assumed that the knowledge offered students would empower them to be better scholars, to live more fully in the world beyond academe. The feminist classroom was the one space where students could raise critical questions about pedagogical process. These critiques were not always encouraged or well received, but they were allowed. That small acceptance of critical interrogation was a crucial challenge, inviting us as students to think seriously about pedagogy in relation to the practice of freedom. When I entered my first undergraduate classroom to teach, I relied on the example of those inspired black women teachers in my grade school, on Freire's work, and on feminist thinking about racial pedagogy. I longed passionately to teach differently from the way I had been taught since high school. The first paradigm that shaped my pedagogy was the idea that the classroom should be an exciting place, never boring. And if boredom should prevail, then pedagogical strategies were needed that would intervene, alter, and even disrupt the atmosphere. Neither Freire's work nor feminist pedagogy examined the notion of pleasure in the classroom. The idea that learning should be exciting, sometimes even fun, was the subject of critical discussion by educators writing about pedagogical practices in grade schools, and sometimes even high schools. But there seemed to be no interest among either traditional or radical educators in discussing the role of excitement in higher education. Excitement in higher education was viewed as potentially disruptive of the atmosphere of seriousness assumed to be essential to the learning process. To enter classroom settings in colleges and universities with the will to share the desire to encourage excitement was to transgress. Not only did it require movement beyond accepted boundaries, but excitement could not be generated without the full recognition of the fact that there could never be an absolute set agenda governing teaching practices. Agendas had to be flexible, had to allow for spontaneous shifts in direction. Students had to be seen in their particularity as individuals. I drew on the strategies my grade school teachers used to get to know us, and interacted with according to their needs. Here, Freire was helpful. Critical reflection on my experience as a student in unexciting classrooms enabled me not only to imagine that the classroom could be exciting, but that this excitement could coexist with and even stimulate serious intellectual and/or academic engagement. But the excitement about ideas was not sufficient to create an exciting learning process. As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voice, in recognizing one another's presence. Since the vast majority of students learn through conservative, traditional educational practices and concern themselves only with the presence of the professor, any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot be simply stated. It has to be demonstrated through pedagogical practices. To begin, the professor must genuinely value everyone's presence. There must be an ongoing recognition that everyone influences the classroom's dynamic, that everyone contributes. These contributions are resources. Used constructively, they enhance the capacity of any class to create an open learning community. Often, before this practice can begin, there has to be some deconstruction of the traditional notion that only the professor is responsible for classroom dynamics. That responsibility is relative to status. Indeed, the professor will always be more responsible because the larger institutional structures will always ensure that accountability for what happens in the classroom rests with the teacher. It is rare that any professor, no matter how eloquent a lecturer, can generate through his or her actions enough excitement to create an exciting classroom. Excitement is generated through collective effort. Seeing the classroom always as a communal place enhances the likelihood of collective effort in creating and sustaining a learning community. One semester, I had a very difficult class, one that completely failed on the communal level. Throughout the term, I thought that the major drawback inhibiting the development of learning community was that the class was scheduled in the early morning, before 9. Almost always, between a third and a half of the class was not fully awake. This, coupled with the tensions of differences, was impossible to overcome. Every now and then we had an exciting session, but mostly it was a dull class. I came to hate this class so much that I had tremendous fear that I would not awaken to attend it the night before, despite alarm clocks, wake-up calls, and the experiential knowledge that I had never forgotten to attend class. I still could not sleep. Rather than making me arrive sleepy, I tended to arrive wired, full of an energy few students mirrored. Time was just one of the factors that prevented this class from becoming a learning community. For reasons I cannot explain, it was also full of resisting students who did not want to learn new pedagogical processes, who did not want to be in a classroom that differed in any way from the norm. To those students, transgressing boundaries was frightening, and though they were not by the majority, their spirit of rigid resistance seemed always to be more powerful than any will to intellectual openness and pleasure in learning. More than any other class, I had thought, this one compelled me to abandon the sense that the professor could, by sheer strength of will and desire, make the classroom an exciting learning community. Before this class, I considered that teaching to transgress education as the practice of freedom would be a book of essays mostly directed to teachers. After the class ended, I began writing with the understanding that I was speaking to and with both students and professors. The scholarly field of writing on critical pedagogy and/or feminist pedagogy continues to be primarily a discourse engaged by white women and men. Freire, too, in conversation with me, as in much of his written work, has always acknowledged that he occupies the location of white maleness, particularly in his country. But the work of various thinkers on radical pedagogy, I use this term to include critical and or feminist perspectives, has in recent years truly included a recognition of differences, those determined by class, race, sexual practice, nationality, and so on. Yet this movement forward does not seem to coincide with any significant increase in black or other non-white voices joining discussions about radical pedagogical practices. Pedagogical practices have emerged from the mutually illuminating interplay of anti-colonial, critical and feminist pedagogies. This complex and unique blending of multiple perspectives have been an engaging and powerful standpoint from which to work. Expanding beyond boundaries, it has made it possible for me to imagine and enact pedagogical practices that engage directly both the concern for interrogating biases in curricula that reinscribe systems of domination, such as racism and sexism, while simultaneously providing new ways to teach these diverse groups of students. In this book, I want to share insights, strategies, and critical reflection on pedagogical practice. I intend these essays to be an intervention, countering the devaluation of teaching even as they address the urgent need for changes in teaching practices. They are meant to serve as constructive commentary. Hopeful and exuberant, they convey the pleasure and joy I experience teaching. These essays are celebratory. To emphasize that the pleasure of teaching is an act of resistance, countering the overwhelming boredom, uninterest, and apathy that so often characterize the way professors and students feel about teaching and learning, about the classroom experience. Each essay addresses common themes that surface again and again in discussions of pedagogy, offering ways to rethink teaching practices and constructive strategies to enhance learning. Written separately for a variety of contexts, there is unavoidably some degree of overlap. Ideas are repeated, key phrases used again and again. Even though I share strategies, these works do not offer blueprints for ways to make the classroom an exciting place for learning. To do so would undermine the insistence that engaged pedagogy recognize each classroom as different, that strategies must constantly be changed, invented, reconceptualized to address each new teaching experience. Teaching is a performative act, and it is that aspect of our work that offers the space for change, invention, spontaneous shifts that can serve as a catalyst drawing out the unique elements in each classroom. To embrace the performative aspect of teaching, we are compelled to engage audiences, to consider issues of reciprocity. Teachers are not performers in the traditional sense of the word, in that our work is not meant to be a spectacle. Yet it is meant to serve as a catalyst that calls everyone to become more and more engaged, to become active participants in learning. Just as the way we perform changes, so should our sense of voice. In our everyday lives, we speak differently to diverse audiences. We communicate best by choosing the way of speaking that is informed by the particularity and uniqueness of whom we are speaking to and with. In keeping with this spirit, these essays don't all sound alike. They reflect my effort to use language in ways that speak to specific contexts, as well as my desire to communicate with a diverse audience. To teach in varied communities, not only paradigms must be shifted, but also the way we think, write, speak. The engaged voice must never be fixed and absolute, but always changing, always evolving in dialogue with a world beyond itself. These essays reflect my experience of critical discussions with teachers, students, and individuals who have entered my classes to observe. Multilayered then, these essays are meant to stand as testimony, bearing witness to education as the practice of freedom. Long before a public ever recognized me as a thinker or writer, I was recognized in the classroom by students, seen by them as a teacher who worked hard to create a dynamic learning experience for all of us. Nowadays, I am recognized more for insurgent intellectual practice. Indeed, the academic public that I encounter at my lectures always shows surprise when I speak intimately and deeply about the classroom. That public seemed particularly surprised when I said that I was working on a collection of essays about teaching. This surprise is a sad reminder of the way teaching is seen as a duller, less valuable aspect of the academic profession. This perspective on teaching is a common one, yet it must be challenged if we are to meet the needs of our students, if we are to restore to education and the classroom excitement about ideas and the will to learn. There is a serious crisis in education. Students often do not want to learn and teachers do not want to teach. More than ever, in the recent history of this nation, educators are compelled to confront the biases that have shaped teaching practices in our society and to create new ways of knowing, different strategies for the sharing of knowledge. We cannot address this crisis if progressive critical thinkers and social critics act as though teaching is not a subject worthy of our regard. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. For years, it has been a place where education has been undermined by teachers and students alike, who seek to use it as a platform for opportunistic concerns rather than as a space to learn. With these essays, I add my voice to the collective call for renewal and rejuvenation in our teaching practices, urging all of us to open our minds and hearts so that we can know beyond the boundary of what is capable, so that we can think and rethink, so that we can create new visions. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. And that completes the introduction chapter of Bell Hook's book, Teaching to Transgress. This was actually written in 1994, and I think through reading it, we really see how valid it is today still. And I want to thank you for listening. And I hope you find ways to implement your wishes and your, to confront the things you're uncomfortable with in your scene, in your job or school or whatever you do in your life. And maybe that some of this could help you think a bit further. And I wish you a very lovely day. Goodbye.